Okay, we're going to talk about percents greater than 100. And these are very, very similar to of what is problems. In a little bit here, you'll see why. Now, before we start, let's talk a little bit about percents. If I have 40%, you've learned in the past that when you work with percents, you got to be able to change percents to decimals and decimals back to percents. And let's talk about how you do that. Now, in 40%, we know the decimals to the far right. In a whole number, the decimal points to the far right. So how do we change a percent back to a decimal? You always move the decimal point 2 places to the left. So if I have 40%, that's the same thing as 0.40. So 40% means the same thing as 0.40, and we simply move the decimal point 2 places to the left. And that should make sense because as I'm looking at this, I would read this, let's see, the 0, the far right digit is in the hundredths place, so I'd read it as 40 hundredths. And since we know that percent means out of 100, 40 hundredths, and that would be 40%. Now let's do one more here just to make sure that we remember this. If I have 5%, now the decimal point, again, is to the far right in a whole number. Now I need to move it 2 places to the left to change it to a decimal. Well, I can only move it 1 place, so I got to add a 0 there. So I got to add a 0 in the direction I'm moving it. Now I can move it 2 places to the left, and I have 0.05. So 0.05 means the same thing as 5%. Let's take a look at example 1. And as we look at this, you can see why these are very similar to of what is problems. So just to review that, remember of means we're going to multiply. The word is means equal, and the word what means that we're going to use a letter or a variable in its place. So make sure you've got that so you can refer back to that. So I'm going to go up to this problem and I'm going to highlight those key words. So I have of, what, and is. So I'm going to make an equation out of this. So I have 20% of, which means multiply, what means a number, and so I have 20% of what number is 15. Now, I've changed all my words to what they mean. Now, 20% of what number is 15? Now, I need to, if I'm going to work with percents, as I said before, we need to change that percent to a decimal. So I'm going to do that first. So I have 0.20 or just 0.2 times n equals 15. Now let's just solve the equation. So let's see, they're multiplying n by 0.2, so what are we going to do? Well, we're going to take 15 and divide it by 0.2. So I'm going to divide both sides. I'm going to change the color there. I'm going to divide both sides by 0.2. And these cancel. So let's see here. I'm going to use the calculator, and we're going to have 15 divided by 0.2. And I get 75. Now let's see if this answer makes sense. Let's see. 20% supposedly of 75 gives us 15. And that does make sense because we know that 50% is half of something, isn't it? Well, 20% of 75 isn't going to be nearly half. And so that makes sense that our answer is 15. All right, let's take a look at one more example. And it says what percent, so what percent of is. So what percent, and I'm going to use P to represent percent because they want an answer of a percent. What percent of times 140 is 98? Now, notice that this isn't a percent there, so I don't need to move the decimal at all. Eventually, I will have to move the decimal. So let's see, they're multiplying by 140. I'm going to divide by 140. These cancel, so P is equal to, now I'm going to take 98 divided by 140, and I get 0.7. But I'm not done, because they want to know what percent. So how do you change a decimal back to a percent? Well, you move it to the back to the right 2 places. So it's 70%. Now let's go back up here and see if that makes sense. So supposedly 70%. Now I know 70% is over half, so I'm going to take over half of something. So 70% of 140 is 98. And let's see, I know that half of 140 is 70. Well, and if I take 70%, I'm going to take more than half of it. So more than half of 70. Yeah, it looks like 98 makes sense. All right, third and final example. Keywords of, is, and what. So 15% of 300 is equal what number? Now, as in example 1, and I'm going to go back to example 1, we had to change, whenever you're dealing with percents, you got to change them to a decimal. For example, in example 1, I couldn't just divide by 20. I had to divide by 0.2. So you got to change the percents to decimals. That's usually how you work with them. So here, I'm going to move it 2 places left. So I have 0.15 of 300 is n. Now simply to get n, you're going to take 0.15 times 300. And I'm cranking that out. So we have 45 is equal to n. Now as always, let's go back and see if this makes sense. 15% of 300. Now when you take 15% of something, you're not taking much of it, are you? Remember, 50% is half. So you're taking much less here. So you're taking a little chunk of 300, and it looks like 45 is a little chunk. So this is lesson 47, and the topic was percents greater than 100.